You are 14 years old, standing in a vast hall under the gaze of 1,000 watching eyes. The man who should protect you, your father, the most powerful ruler alive, has just given your body away with a single drunken sentence. At first, you don't even understand what has happened. You only feel the air change. The room goes cold. Music dies mid-note. Conversations vanish. Even the torches seem to hesitate, flickering as if in disbelief. Across the banquet hall, the man who asked for you is smiling. An aging general, older than your grandfather. He knows your father cannot take the words back. Not here. Not in front of the entire empire. Your hands begin to tremble. Your mother hides her face. Every woman in the room understands instantly. Your life no longer belongs to you. And your father, the King of Kings, doesn't look at you. He looks past you, toward his reputation, his pride, the image of a god-emperor he cannot allow to fracture. When he finally speaks, he uses a single word. Granted, the guests applaud, the general bows. You stand frozen, forcing down a scream no one will ever hear. Because in this palace, a daughter's suffering weighs less than a king's ego. And in this quiet moment of public betrayal, her story effectively ends. Her name was Amestris. What happened to her is one of history's most disturbing examples of how absolute power destroys even those it claims to love. If the hidden horrors of the past draw you in, welcome to grim history. And as this story unfolds, notice the moment that unsettles you most, because this is where a single drunken decision became the beginning of 14 years of psychological torment. But to understand her fate, you first have to understand the world she was born into. This was a world where one man's word could reshape the lives of millions. Xerxes was not merely a king. He was the King of Kings, ruler of an empire stretching from Libya to the Indus Valley, from Thrace to Ethiopia. Nearly 50 million people lived under his authority. According to Herodotus, who later spoke with Persians who had served inside Xerxes' own court, his words were not suggestions. They were law. A single breath from his lips could save a nation, or erase one. Yet the greatest danger wasn't beyond the palace walls. It was inside them. The Persian court was not a home. It was a sealed fortress of silence, guarded by eunuchs who owed their lives entirely to the king. No rumor escaped. No dissent survived. Everyone within those walls understood a terrifying truth. The closer you stood to absolute power, the easier it was to be destroyed by it. Even the king's own family lived under suffocating control. Every movement was regulated, where they walked, who they spoke to, even when they were allowed to eat. Privacy did not exist. Autonomy did not exist. For the women of the royal household, especially the king's daughters, life was both elevated and terrifying. They were paraded in ceremony, but hidden in reality. Treasures of the empire with less freedom than its servants. Royal daughters were rarely celebrated in inscriptions. Many weren't even named in official records. They existed as political currency, bargaining tools, alliance tokens, offerings wrapped in gold and jewels. And if that sounds bleak, what comes next is far worse. What happened to Amestris wasn't just tragic. It was something even her own people whispered about in fear. Because in a court ruled by absolute will, mistakes never ruined the king. They ruined someone else. And for her, that mistake was about to be made publicly, permanently, and in front of thousands. Amestris belonged to this world, but her position was unusual. She shared her name with Xerxes' principal wife, the elder Amestris, remembered in surviving sources for her fierce and often ruthless nature. The younger Amestris, however, was born to one of the king's secondary concubines, a woman of Bactrian origin. Even in a court where beauty was carefully curated, her appearance was noted as exceptional. She was raised in the women's quarters of the palace, educated by eunuchs and elder concubines. She learned what was expected of royal daughters: dance, music, poetry, embroidery. But sources hint at something unusual. Xerxes kept her close long after other daughters were sent away in strategic marriages. In the Persian court, a father's affection might sound like protection. Here, it became the first step toward her destruction. Everything changed at a single banquet in 479 BCE. Greek and Persian accounts differ in detail, but the core of the story remains chillingly consistent. Herodotus provides the most complete version, claiming it came from Persian courtiers who later fled to Greece. According to this account, Xerxes had been drinking for days, surrounded by flatterers feeding his sense of divinity and power. In a moment of drunken arrogance, he rose before thousands of guests and swore an oath by the Persian gods. He would grant any request made of him. It was a catastrophic promise, and someone in the hall immediately understood that. Artabanus, an aging general once loyal to Xerxes' father, Darius, had already lost 3 wives. He was over 60, politically sidelined, and painfully aware of his fading influence. He also understood the value of tying himself to the royal bloodline. More importantly, he knew this. Xerxes could not break a public oath. Not after his humiliating military failures in Greece. To refuse now would be seen as weakness by the entire empire. So, Artabanus stood, and what he asked for would change a young girl's life forever. He bowed, and then asked for something no one in the hall believed he would dare to request. He asked for the king's daughter. He asked for a mistress. A silence fell so heavy, it seemed to consume the room. Guests looked back and forth between the general and the throne, fully grasping the enormity of what had just been spoken. Royal princesses were almost never married to ordinary subjects, and when they were, it was to young princes of noble blood, not aging generals nearing the end of their lives. Everyone waited for Xerxes to explode in fury. Everyone expected refusal. Everyone was wrong. Xerxes had sworn a public oath, one he could not undo. Herodotus describes the king turning pale, his hands tightening around the arms of his throne, his eyes darting through the hall like a trapped animal. Long minutes passed, thick, suffocating minutes, before he finally forced out a single word. Granted. With that, Amestris's fate was sealed. Later fragments suggest she tried to plead with her father immediately after. In private, she begged him to retract the promise, to find any loophole that might save her from the life she already feared. But Xerxes, torn between genuine affection for his daughter and the necessity of preserving the image of an unbreakable ruler, chose the image. He justified his choice with politics. Artabanus, publicly humiliated, could become a dangerous enemy. Binding him to the royal family through marriage would stabilize the court. It was the same reasoning whispered by autocrats throughout history. The good of the state outweighs the life of a daughter. 3 months later, the marriage was performed with all the splendor expected of a Persian princess. Silk, gold, and jewels worth more than entire cities adorned the ceremony. But those who witnessed it remembered something else entirely. Beneath the finery, Amestris moved like an actress trained to hide despair. Her beauty only sharpened the tragedy. She passed through the rituals in silence, her expression fixed somewhere between obedience and dread. Artabanus, meanwhile, radiated triumph. He had gained not only a young and beautiful wife, but a permanent and intimate connection to the Achaemenid bloodline. The ceremony ended. The consequences were just beginning. They were far darker than anyone in that hall could have imagined. The age gap alone was staggering. Amestris was barely 14. Artabanus was well past 60. Even in a society where marriages between older men and young girls were not unheard of, this union disturbed the palace. Whispers spread through corridors and courtyards. Murmurs of Xerxes' cruelty. Accusations that he had sacrificed his own daughter to preserve his pride. And those whispers grew louder as the truth of the marriage emerged. Because it became clear very quickly. Amestris had not entered a marriage. She had entered a sentence. Artabanus, obsessed with control and possession, kept his royal bride in near total isolation. Sources recount that he forbade her from visiting her family quarters, or even speaking with her mother and sisters. In Persian culture, where bonds between women were essential for emotional survival, this severing of ties was especially brutal. Amestris was effectively imprisoned in Artabanus's quarters, watched by servants fiercely loyal to him. She had no freedom of movement, no privacy, and no autonomy of any kind. Fragmented correspondence suggests she tried to send secret messages to her father, begging him to intervene. Xerxes never replied. Ashamed of his decision, yet unwilling to undo it and expose weakness, he chose silence. That silence would haunt her. The most disturbing aspect of Artabanus's behavior lay in his conjugal demands. Ancient sources are careful with their language, but the meaning is unmistakable. Despite his advanced age, he subjected Amestris to frequent, forced marital relations. His fixation was singular: to produce an heir with royal blood, one who would secure his place in the imperial hierarchy. Court physicians were summoned. Administrative records mention payments for fertility specialists, herbal treatments, and medicinal concoctions intended to ensure conception. None of this was done for her well-being. She was not treated as a wife. She was treated as a vessel. 3 years into the marriage, in 476 BCE, Amestris finally became pregnant. Artabanus celebrated with lavish sacrifices to the Persian gods. To him, the child represented triumph and permanence. To Amestris, the pregnancy carried a far darker meaning. She understood that bearing his heir would bind her to him forever. Mothers of royal children could not be dismissed, divorced, or released. Her fate would become permanent. Servants later described her pregnancy as heavy with grief. She spent long hours staring towards the palace gardens, where she once danced freely, silent tears tracing her face. She often refused food, forcing attendants to intervene. The girl who had once moved with grace now moved only with fear. In her 9th month, she went into labor, a brutal ordeal that stretched over 2 days. Court midwives recorded severe complications. When the child was finally born, a boy, Artabanus immediately named him Xerxes, honoring the imperial grandfather. The infant was weak from the beginning. Palace physicians doubted he would survive. Artabanus ignored their warnings and began planning ceremonies to present the child publicly. Those ceremonies never happened. 10 days later, the baby died. Official records attributed the death to respiratory failure. But within the shadows of the palace, darker rumors spread. Some whispered that Amestris, driven beyond endurance, had taken the child's life herself, seeing no other escape. Others claimed that servants, horrified by her suffering, had deliberately neglected the infant. The truth was never recorded. Only the silence remained. No version of the story can be proven with certainty. Yet the very existence of these rumors tells us everything we need to know about how desperate and unbearable her life had become. And those whispers did not fade quietly. The death of the child unleashed something dark within Artabanus. Convinced that Amestris, or her attendants, were responsible, his behavior turned openly violent. He became increasingly cruel, increasingly controlling. Servants later reported hearing screams behind closed doors. They saw bruises on her arms and face. On one recorded occasion, Artabanus beat her so severely that she was confined to her bed for weeks. When her body healed, her mind did not. Witnesses described a complete psychological collapse. The young woman who once pleaded, resisted, and searched desperately for small moments of freedom now moved through the palace like a ghost. She ate only when forced. She spoke rarely, if at all. She could sit for hours without moving, staring into nothing, her spirit emptied. Eventually, word of her condition reached Xerxes. Only then did he seem to grasp the full weight of what he had done to his daughter. Some sources suggest he attempted a discreet intervention, quietly instructing Artabanus to treat her with greater care. But on this matter, the king's authority meant very little. Artabanus was now bound to the royal family by marriage, and he understood something vital. Xerxes had already sacrificed his daughter once to preserve his image. That weakness gave Artabanus power. He knew he could act without consequence. The same king who had created her suffering was now incapable of stopping it. When confronted, Artabanus responded with carefully worded reminders. The king himself had consented to the marriage, and under Persian custom, the treatment of a wife fell entirely under her husband's authority. To challenge that would be to challenge the very traditions that supported imperial rule. Trapped by his own decision, Xerxes withdrew. Amestris remained with Artabanus. Her suffering continued, uninterrupted. But history has a way of turning against the choices we try hardest to ignore. 14 years after her forced marriage, everything changed. Xerxes was assassinated in a palace coup led by Artabanus and several co-conspirators. The motivations were complex: succession struggles, rival factions, long-standing resentments. Yet some accounts claim Artabanus twisted Amestris' suffering into a justification for murder. He allegedly told his allies that Xerxes had become a weak tyrant, a man so flawed in judgment that he sacrificed his own daughter to preserve his image. It was a breathtaking act of hypocrisy. The cruelty Artabanus inflicted became the excuse he used to kill the man who had allowed it. For a brief moment, the coup succeeded. Artabanus seized control of the palace and ruled from the shadows for 7 months. But Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, eventually rallied loyal forces, crushed the rebellion, and confronted the general inside the palace. Artabanus was killed in a violent clash with the royal guard. His power ended with the same brutality he had inflicted on the young woman he imprisoned. One might imagine that his death brought Amestris freedom, perhaps even relief. It did not. By then, she was 28 years old. Yet witnesses described a woman who looked decades older. Her hair was streaked with premature gray. Her face was hollow, her expression empty. Artaxerxes, her half-brother and now king, attempted to restore her place at court. He offered her private chambers, attendance, and the autonomy she had been denied for most of her life. She barely accepted any of it. Amestris rarely left her rooms. She refused banquets, ceremonies, and festivals. Servants observed that she could go days, sometimes weeks, without speaking a single word. At one point, musicians were sent to lift her spirits. They played a melody she had once danced to on that distant night before everything was taken from her. The moment she heard it, something inside her broke. She screamed, raw, uncontrolled, and shattered the instruments before collapsing in tears. The first tears anyone had seen from her in years. She never recovered. Amestris died at the age of 36. Contemporary sources vaguely describe a prolonged illness. Modern interpretations suggest something far more devastating: slow self-starvation, or a severe depression that led to physical collapse. Whatever the medical explanation, those who lived alongside her understood the deeper truth. She did not truly die in 457 BCE. She died the night her father said, "Granted." Her body survived for 2 more decades. Her spirit did not. Her story was quietly buried. Achaemenid royal inscriptions never mention her. Xerxes is remembered as a builder, an empire maker, the ruler who challenged Greece, not as the man who sacrificed his daughter to protect his pride. Only in Greek accounts, Herodotus and later chroniclers, who preserved fragments of Persian oral tradition, does her tragedy survive. Even there, she appears not as a fully realized person, but as a footnote illustrating the excesses of the Persian court. Yet, when we gather those fragments, administrative tablets, scattered testimonies, faint echoes in ancient texts, we can reconstruct the outline of a life shaped entirely by suffering. Suffering born from a single impulsive decision made by a father drunk on power and surrounded by sycophants. Amestris' story forces us to confront a universal truth. The most devastating violence is not always inflicted by enemies or armies. Sometimes it comes from those closest to us, parents, rulers, guardians, who wield absolute authority without conscience. Xerxes never struck her with his own hands. He did not lock her away, nor did he order her execution. And yet, with a single careless promise, spoken to impress his court, he destroyed her as completely as any executioner ever could. This is the true cruelty of absolute power. It is violence that leaves no visible scars, yet shatters a life beyond repair. A form of harm that hides behind ceremony, tradition, and silence. The tragedy of Amestris is not hers alone. It is the tragedy of all who live under unchecked authority, where the will of one person becomes destiny for everyone beneath them. Her story survives only in scattered fragments, carried across 25 centuries. And in those fragments lies a reminder. The greatest horrors do not always erupt in battlefields or revolutions. They often unfold quietly, in private rooms, through decisions made behind palace walls. Decisions powerful men never revisit, but that their children can never escape. If this story affected you, and you want to explore more documented accounts from the darkest corners of empires and monarchies, consider subscribing. Let us know in the comments which civilization or historical figure you want us to uncover next. And if you've stayed with us through this entire descent, write a mistress in the comments, so we know you walked this path with us from beginning to end.